Hello. Good morning. It's early in the morning. Sorry for the light. It's dark here. I had to do this early this morning. So we're going to talk about considerations for trees. So there's not too many. We're just going to talk about the main things to think about before you plant a tree. All right, let's do this. Let me get in the right position so my lighting is good. There we go. Better position so my head is blocking that lamp. All right. So trees. First thing we need to consider when we're planting trees is their size. So I've seen many times where people are planting their trees that are too big. They don't take in consideration how big that tree is going to get when it's mature, right? They buy that little tree, a little pot from the nursery. You take it home and it's growing nice, and eventually, 10 years, 5 years later, it's a monster, 20 foot high tree. I did that before at home. I accidentally planted I bought when I was like 12 years old a little Christmas tree, a live Christmas tree, which was an Italian stone pine, and I planted it 3 feet from the house. And it turned into a monster, and we had to cut it down, and I was sad. But that's what happens. I've seen that many times down the street from the college, off of Victor Valley College, Bear Valley Road in the high desert, where the Winco is, if you know where that is, as you're driving that way on the side of the road in this landscaping in the shopping center, they planted these trees underneath power lines that ran alongside the road and also right in front of the business signs for all the businesses that are there along the road. And because of that, these trees, which should have been selected, it had 15 feet of room. They could have picked some small trees that stayed under that height, but instead they used trees that get 25, 30 feet high. So now they have to, every few months, waste money and labor to have landscapers come in and top these trees and basically turn these trees into hedges so that the people can see the business signs and so that it doesn't grow into the power lines. And that's a waste of money, a waste of labor. That was somebody not planning, not thinking about the environment. They just did a landscape design somewhere else without ever going to the site or just not knowing their plants. So size is really important. You can't put your trees too close to buildings, too close to walls. Um, One, they're just too big and they can physically damage the structures as they get older. Two, it might look funny, it looked out of scale to have such a big tree near such a small house or small building. It just doesn't look right. The scale is wrong. And just not taking consideration the size of these trees. The other thing that people forget about the size of these trees is as the trees get bigger, they cast shade. And the shade will be to the north, usually, of that tree. And over time, as that tree grows, so does the shadow footprint, the shade footprint of that tree. And that changes what can grow there. If one part, for a while, one section of your yard is in the sun, but as this tree starts to grow, especially to the south of that area, eventually that area is in shade, and those plants are going to not do as well, not thrive as well. So considering where that shade goes, sometimes you want that shade, and sometimes you don't want that shade. It really does depend. You remember that area of shade is going to grow along with your tree. Also, as trees grow too, so do their roots. And the area under the tree where plants in the beginning, you might have been able to put plants and they did really well. Eventually, those areas become full of the tree roots as the tree grows. And now those trees are now competing directly with the tree roots and they might not win, right? Some of those plants you originally planted might not be suitable for growing in uh, close contact with tree roots. So, again, definitely consider the size of your tree, the mature size. Research it. Be like, okay, can I fit a 25, 35-foot tree? Am I willing to pay to prune it to stay smaller? Because pruning trees is very expensive. That's the next thing we're going to talk about, right? Is it going to be, are you able to maintain that tree, right, at a size? And go out there and get a tape measure. put it out at 12, 15 feet so you can literally see how high that is. Sometimes when I was doing landscape design, people are like, oh yeah, that's fine. And then when they see the tree, they're like, wow, that's too big. And I'm like, well, that's 15 feet. So some people don't have a concept of what that size is like. So you might have to show yourself or somebody else. All right, so first consideration, besides, is it the right tree for the climate? Is it the right size? Two, are you going to be able to maintain that tree for its appropriate size? Because all trees, for the most part, in my opinion, will need pruning, either some point in their life or regular pruning, because trees, especially large ones, can kill people, right? There's been many times where a tree branch just falls down, or not even in the wind, just randomly breaks and falls down and kills people in the park. It's happened before in LA. People have died from just large tree branch breaking off, and that's not good. Or a tree branch can break off and destroy someone's car on the street, or fence, or house, or anything. So trees have potential to be destructive because they're big, and therefore they need to be inspected regularly, especially large trees and old trees. They need to be inspected regularly and then treated appropriately, pruned appropriately by a certified arborist or a tree doctor, somebody who really knows what they're doing. And that might be expensive, right? A large, big tree having to do even minor pruning, maybe not every year, but every 3, 5, 6 years, is pretty expensive, right? So, and it gets more expensive if you don't prune regularly, and then the crew has to come out and do major work to a tree. Instead of doing it frequently, small steps, people tend to wait until there's a problem, and then it's expensive. Because even cutting the tree down, even if you're like, my mom has a tree that's like this. I was like, well, why don't we just cut the tree down? Okay, well, it's going to be several $1,000s, probably $3,000 to $4,000 to cut this big tree down. And she's like, what? She's like, well, how much would it cost just to fix it the way I would like it to look like, trim it to make it look nicer? And I said, about the same. I'm like, either way, it's about the same price. Because when they cut the tree down, they still have to haul it and pay for all that stuff. It's just less, cutting the tree down is less delicate work. They just cut it down. It's still work. Whereas trimming the tree properly would take quite a bit longer because they have to do it right. So it ends up costing about the same, maybe even a little more to prune it correctly. So anyhow, remember that the maintenance of that tree is very important for its health and also for safety and things like that. We'll do a video later on pruning. It's a little too early still here in Southern California. I'm making this video in October, late October. And around in these parts, it's too early. I typically don't recommend tree pruning until the end of November into December, when the trees are deciduous trees, are a little bit more asleep. Because you don't want to risk pruning too early, because around here it's still pretty hot in October, and you can get sunburn and damage on your trees if you prune too early. We don't want to prune too late because we don't want to cause the trees to wake up too early. So that's why we like to do it at the end of November, early December, kind of the peak of the short days that we know that our deciduous trees are asleep. Evergreen trees, they're growing around, but we also like to prune them in the winter so they don't get the heat stress. But we'll do a whole video on pruning. But pruning and knowing how to maintain your tree, super important. Okay, root problems. It's another thing we see with root trees. Some species of trees, let's say like figs, we just did a video on the Callery pear. Those trees have somewhat, I wouldn't call them invasive roots, but they have roots that are shallow and are very good at exploring and getting into places where there's water, and can become a problem in an urban environment, breaking cement, paths, walls, pipes, etc. Because their roots are very strong, and they're very shallow, and they're very good at exploring the surface for water. Right? So these are the type of trees you don't want to plant in grass or in small planters. Every time I go to a city, in my area, the sidewalks are all messed up because They planted ficus trees, the absolute worst tree to plant as a street tree. And people freak out when they get cut them down because, well, it's destroying the pipes and the infrastructure on the sidewalk. It's making it dangerous for people to use. So they end up having to cut them down and replacing them with trees that have a different type of root system. And those are trees with deep roots. A tap-rooted tree or a deep-rooted tree, those roots are designed to go down, and they look for groundwater deeper down instead of surface water. And those trees tend to be less of a problem. And there's also just trees that are not as aggressively rooted. They have finer roots. Those tend to be the smaller trees, the trees that are naturally not so big. Because you can have a tree that you prune to keep small, right? But the roots are humongous, right? The roots are big. They go everywhere. Because the roots, you're not pruning the roots, they keep going. You're pruning the top of the tree, but the rest of the tree is still getting big. So smaller sized trees tend to have smaller sized root systems. So think of the roots of a tree as spreading out at least the size of the tree in width, or even more naturally. It would be wider than the tree's actual crown, right? So roots are important. Root guards, they do work, but they don't work that great. They work good for small trees, and they're kind of expensive. Those are plastic, like fences you put in the roots. In theory, the roots hit these plastic sheets and they grow down and then underneath it, and that causes those roots to go deep. But I've seen in landscaping where the roots hit that sheet, grow down, and then grow right back up and cause a problem again. So they don't always work. So again, it's more importantly to realize the tree's growing habit and its root sizes and things like that. All right, number 3 on tree consideration is the shape of the tree. Not all trees are round, lollipop, or umbrella shaped. Some are tall and skinny. Some are kind of shaped like a spindle or something, columnar, thin, weepy, staggered like a bonsai. Many really interesting shapes. And this is what's really fun with trees is since they're big plants, they're already accent plants in a landscape. So choose one with an interesting shape. Might as well. Especially a deciduous tree, a tree that will lose its leaves in the winter. You'll be left with this nice branching structure against the sky that looks nice. And the shape of the tree also lends itself to the landscape, right? Whether if you're using it to sit under, you might want more of an umbrella shape. If it's being used for a windbreak, you might want more of a vertical, conical shape, right? If it's a shade tree for a large area, you want a big, really big, expansive umbrella shape, right? So the shape will also is conducive to the tree's use, right? What the tree can provide for that landscape. Also, when you're choosing trees do more than just shade. They do more than wind breaking. There's trees that have flowers, and there's trees that have beautiful fall color, yellow, orange, purple leaves in the fall this time of year. And there's trees that have colorful foliage. The foliage stays colored year round. So a good example of this is like a western redbud, forest pansy tree. The leaves, or smoke tree. I love smoke trees. Catinus cogigera, which we'll have on a different list. It's got purple leaves in the summer. In the fall, those purple leaves turn orange. In the winter, it's got white branches, interesting branch structure. In the spring, it's got smoky flowers. So this tree does something every season. Another good example is a crepe myrtle. Again, spring flowers, nice summer foliage, fall color, winter interesting bark and tree structure. So there's something to some of those trees every season. So they provide a dynamic, changing component to a landscape. And because they're so big, it's very obvious. So I remember exploring that. Windbreaks. We're in the desert. Many places in Southern California are windy, and out in the high desert, Mojave Desert, where many of my students are, it's very windy. So you want a windbreak tree. The best windbreak trees tend to be evergreen because we get winds all the time, and trees whose branch structure goes down fairly low, almost to the ground. So the goal is we don't need to walk underneath. We're trying to block the wind. And typically we might use a row of two trees, a taller tree and then a shorter tree, so the wind gets pushed up and over this windbreak. Windbreaks are so good because they don't really block the wind, they push the wind up, but also wind still blows through the canopies of the trees, and we don't get as much turbulence on the other side. So, not necessarily a dam, but kind of like a guide to a buffer to buffer the winds. It's also a good idea to put a fence on the inside of the windbreak. So if here's the outside of the windbreak, let me get my hands right. So see how my hands are uh, slanted. So the front of the windbreak, the shorter part of the windbreak here, the tallest trees here. Putting a fence on the back side of the tall trees or a row of shrubs also will help with the windbreak. And also make sure that the windbreak is, a decent uh, in proximity. If it's way far away, of course, it's not going to work. It has to be relatively close in. What else to think about trees? Different tree forms, single trunk versus multi-trunk. I love multi-trunk trees. They look more naturalistic and they're really interesting. The only problem with the multi-trunk trees is they do have a tendency to snap. So if you have like a group of trunks here and it gets windy, one of these trunks can easily bend out and they will snap here at that crotch. So you have to, again, make sure the trees are well pruned. And again, we'll go over pruning in another demonstration lecture video and stuff like that. So the trees on your list, your video list that you have in Plan AD, if you're watching this video in Plan AD, even though those trees aren't necessarily all the prettiest, those are trees that grow really well for the Mojave Desert in Southern California. And that's only a fraction of the trees. Again, that's only a list of 10 out of hundreds of trees. So you have a lot of options. And we're not even counting all the native trees, but definitely native trees. So if you're looking for trees that require a little bit of water and very low pest pressure, easy to grow, native trees to wherever you're at are always your first choice. So, for example, here in my neighborhood, like I said, they're getting rid of those ficus trees and they are replacing them with either native oak trees or some non native trees that are just smaller, a lot smaller to scale. So they're not going to tear up the sidewalk. And this is a big problem we had in the past, with street trees. People just put them in willy nilly, not really considering how big they get or the roots, and then we had a lot of problems. What else? Oh, trees are a good source of fertilizer. If you have a legume, remember legumes have bacteria in their roots that help them take nitrogen out of the air and put it in the ground. Legume trees are great, especially in a permaculture situation or in a plant guild situation, for really providing like a stability in that nutrient levels. All trees, especially deciduous ones, drop their leaves. Even evergreen trees do, either a little bit at a time or in flushes. But all trees provide leaf litter, right? All those leaves that you rake away and put in the trash, that's a whole bunch of energy. That's all nutrients, compost. Some of the best compost is composted leaves. So one thing I tell my permaculture students is, and everybody, is to take those leaves, put them in a trash can, let them get really dry and crunchy. Get a weed whacker or your hands or something, and just crush it up into that trash can into smaller pieces. Just crush up. Pine needles are great because you don't have to crush them up. Or small leaves are great because you don't have to crush them up. But big leaves, just break them up a bit, and then use that leaf, those leaves, those crushed up dry leaves, literally as a mulch. I put them in my veggie garden. I mulch the ground, cover it completely with dead leaves. And sometimes I put the dead leaves in a little bit of straw too, just to hold it down so it don't blow away. And that turns into great nutrient packed soil. In the forest, that's one of the main ways that nutrients get cycled back into the soil is when all the leaves fall back down to the ground and get um, used up, decomposed by the fungi and the bacteria. So remember that all trees do provide a source of fertilizer. If you're removing a tree, especially a big tree, and you want to put a tree there in that spot again, you need to do a couple things. One, you need to remove the stump and as many of the big woody roots as possible. Um, Even if you're not going to plant the tree right in that same spot, even if it's going to go near it, what happens is all that dead wood decomposing in the ground. It's a lot of dead wood, especially if there's a big tree and the stump. It sucks up nitrogen because the fungi and the need to use the nitrogen to eat that wood. And also, some trees don't like being planted in fresh wood. Many trees don't like being planted in near fresh wood, freshly cut wood. So again, remove as much of the stump, much of the roots. Take all that sawdust and wood product out. You can use that as mulch on top of the ground. Don't bury it in the ground. Just throw it on top of the ground before you plant your tree. And you might have to put new soil in that crater, that hole that you took out. Also, be wary of planting the same tree. Imagine somebody died in your bed, and then we're like, okay, this is your bed, and you're going to go sleep in this bed with this dead, decomposing corpse of another person. Same thing with the tree roots, right? There was an elm tree, you cut it down, and an elm tree and stump are decomposing in the ground. You're going to put a new elm tree there, or it's not. I would do a different tree, right? This is especially true of fruit trees. So if fruit tree dies, you really should clean out that root system and think of something else to put there. Not the exact same tree, and also figure out why it died. So just remember that. There's things like saltpeter that also make the stumps decompose faster. Now the wood chips from all your pruning, you cut branches, you take out a stump, grind that up and throw that on top of the ground as a mulch, and that's also really, really good mulch as well for most plants. It's a woody mulch. In fact, if you have a big property, one of the nicest things, like I do, is I just call the tree trimmers and ask them, hey, do you have a good load of chipped up wood that doesn't have palms or cactus or anything spiky? And I said, just bring that over, and they will dump it in my driveway, and I use that for everything as a mulch. You don't want palm trees and cactuses because they have thorns and spikes on their leaves. You just want it for safety. You don't want those. Poisonous plants. So, like if I were to take poison oak and mulch it, to put it in a wood chipper, those wood chips would be toxic to people. Would have the same urushiol content active for a while, but not forever. They will start to break down, decompose. So yes, you could worry about poisonous plants in the wood, but in the long run, if it's not going to be somewhere accessible, it shouldn't be a problem. So use those wood mulch to your things. Also, last thing before we're done, consideration of trees. Think of trees as a source of wood material, wood lots. I have a weedy tree in my yard, and in my old yard, I had this tree that was not a good tree. We had to cut it down, and the stump produced these really tall, long sprouts after we cut the tree down. I left it for a while, and these sprouts would come, but they formed these beautiful, long, straight branches, and I use that as a source of stakes for my veggie garden. So I go out there and just cut the branch, take the leaves, and now I have this nice 10, 12-foot straight wooden pole, a source for wooden poles. Bamboo, for example. You grow bamboo, good source wooden poles. Many people have a wood lot where they grow a tree up to a certain size. They cut that tree to the ground, use that wood, and then allow that tree to resprout as a multi-trunk, grow big again, and then do the same thing. Harvest it for wood. It could be for firewood. It could be for fence posts, construction. Who knows? But that's how you did it back in the day. You plant your wood, plant your trees for wood, and that's called a wood lot. So if you do have enough space, you can dedicate some of your garden to growing trees just for wood. I think that's it for the considerations of trees. The next big one will be the pruning, where you guys will see some pruning techniques. If you're in my permaculture class, we're going to do live pruning at the garden. And if you're in the desert class, we'll be doing live pruning at the college. All right. Thank you so much.